Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history. In this space, I'm going to talk about the Indo-Greeks, and particularly we are going to discuss how the Indo-Greek history has been interpreted by different scholars. Now, when we talk about the Indo-Greek history, first of all, let's discuss the terminologies that are used in the sources. So when we look at the Sanskrit sources, we find that the term Yavan has been used for the Indo-Greeks. Now, this term Yavan comes from the Persian term Yon, and this Persian term Yon itself is derived from the term Ionia, which was, the Greeks who lived in the Asian mainland. So these were the Ionian Greeks who were part of the Achaemenid Empire, and in order to refer to the whole Greeks, the Achaemenid used the term Yon. And from the Achaemenid Empire, the Sanskrit sources or the people of India also picked this term and they converted this term Yon to Yavan. So that is how this term Yavan comes from. Now, the interaction between the Greeks and the Indians, it did not begin during the period of Alexander or after it. We find that there are evidence which suggest that even before Alexander's invasion, there was a contact between the Greeks and the Indians. So we all know that in Achaemenid Empire, the Greeks, particularly Ionian Greeks, were employed by the Achaemenid emperors, and there are two main Ionian Greeks who wrote about India, and they were in the service of the Achaemenid court. These were Scylax and Catiesis. Now, Scylax, according to the Greek sources, Scylax was tasked by I think it was Darius first, if I'm not wrong. So Darius first had asked him to map out the Indus. So it appears that during this period, Darius first has control over the Indus region. So he had asked Scylax to map out the Indus River. So this is what early Greek sources tell us about particularly India. Now, when we look at Indian sources, one of the earliest evidence of Greeks comes from Panini, and Panini in his Ashtadhyayi mentions the term Yavan. So this clearly shows that this was before the coming of the Alexander. Now, it could be the case that these Greeks, they had some type of settlement in particularly in the west of the Indian subcontinent, because there is this reference to the settlement of Nysa, which appears in Arian, and Arian tells us that the citizen of the Nysa, they were not Indians, and according to Arian talks about the invasion of Dionysus. So these citizens of Nysa who were not Indians, they came from Greek when Dionysus invaded India. So this was about the early contact between the Greeks and the ancient Indians. Now, when we look at the history of the Indo-Greeks and so in the historiography of this topic, there are two works which are considered to be the major works about this topic. So first was written around 1951, and this was written by a British historian named W. Tarn. Now, the title of this work was The Greeks in Bactria and India. And another major work was written in 1957 by an Indian historian whose name was A.K. Narain, and the title of this book was The Indo-Greeks. Now, in the title itself, you can see how these two historians viewed the whole topic of Indo-Greek history or the Greeks' settlements in India. So, Tarn, the British historian Tarn, has this title, The Greeks in Bactria and India. So the title itself suggests that the view of Tarn was a Greek centric view, and there is this quote which I think tells us about how what he believed by this how what he believed about this subject. So he writes, "It is unfortunate that in Britain, and I think everywhere, the story of the Greeks in India has been treated as part of Indian history alone." So what he wanted, so basically when he wrote this book, his main aim was to set the subject in its right place. So right place would be that he wanted, what Tarn has this view that, the Greek history, the Indo-Greek history, these Greeks who settled in India were not part of Indian history. They belonged to the culture of the European civilization, or the classical civilization. So there's this question which Tarn has focused on in his work, and he wants to so his whole work is basically an attempt to answer where did all the Greeks come from, and because these Greeks had arrived from the Greek region itself, so we should think of the history of the Indo-Greeks as the history of Greece, not in terms of history of India. Whereas when you look at the work of A.K. Narain, he has a completely different view. So the title itself, the Indo-Greeks, suggests that Narain has this view that these Indo-Greeks were part of a cross fertilization between the two civilization, the Indian and the Hellenic civilization, and his main attempt is to focus on the assimilation of the Greeks into Indian population. And I think there is this brilliant phrase that appears in his book, and I want to quote it. So he writes, "They came, they saw, but India conquered." So this this quote suggests what Narain believes about this subject. And in reply to this, the question of Tarn, in which he writes that we have to see the Greeks in India as part of Greek history, not Indian history. So Narain argues that if the history of Bactria, so this is the quote from his book, he writes that if the history of the Bactrian / Indo-Greeks is not part of India's history, then why consider the history of the Shakas, Kushanas, or Mughals as part of Indian history and not of the homelands of these people? So his argument, that is Narayan's argument, is pretty straightforward. Since these Greeks are now living in India, so we should, it is quite obvious to think of them as part of Indian history rather than considering them as part of the classical history. And there is this another quote, when the Greeks of Bactria and India lost their kingdom, they were not all killed, nor did they return to Greece. So here, the whole point of assimilation of the Indo-Greeks into the Indian population is clearly, we can see. Now, when you read both of these works side by side, you would also find that the training of these historians also impacts how they understood the evidence or the sources of Indo-Greek history. So when you look at Tarn's book or Tarn's background, Tarn had a classical training. So he was a classicist by training. So most of his sources and his focus is on the classical sources. Whereas when you look at the book by Narain and his background, Narain was a numismatist by training. So his focus is more on the coins of the Indo-Greeks, and that is why when you read these two books side by side, you will find that in Narayan's analysis, coins of the Indo-Greeks and what we can learn from these coins plays an important role when we compare it to the work of Tarn. So this important point, I think, shows how the training of a particular historian and how he views a particular topic, how these two things are related. So in Tarn's analysis, classical sources are more prominent, where when you look at Narain's view, it is the numismatic sources that are more prominent compared to the classical sources. Although that does not mean both that Tarn ignores numismatic evidence or Narain ignores the textual evidence, but one could easily see what is the main focus of a particular historian. So this is, I think, the important point which we should keep in mind. These are the two views. So Narain has this view that he is more of a Indian centric view, we can call it, and Tarn has this a Eurocentric or Greek centric view. But interestingly, there is this great scholar, Pakistani. He was a Pakistani, and his name was A.H. Dani. Now he has, he delivered a lecture in Lahore on Indo-Greek history, and the published lecture has this great title, which I find quite interesting. The title of this published lecture was Bactrian and Indus Greeks. So this was published around 1991. So what A.H. Dani does is that he has problem with the term Indian or Indo-Greek. So instead of writing Indo-Greeks, he writes Bactrian and Indus Greeks. So you can see how different historians of different nationalities have tried to accommodate or understand this Indo-Greek history. Now, although most scholars do not agree with A.H. Dani views, but it is quite interesting to think about how A.H. Dani has this term Indus Greeks. Now, coming to the point of Narain and this whole debate between Narain and Tarn, I think we should not think of Narayan's view as a nationalistic view, because in most cases we find that other British scholars, like particularly famous scholars like A.L. Basham was in some ways more close to the understanding of Narain compared to Tarn's view. So one should not think of Narayan's understanding of Indo-Greeks as a nationalistic or Indian-centric understanding. So I think this is an important aspect of Narayan's work that we should keep in mind. Now, before I think talking about the interpretation of Indo-Greek history, I think it is important to first have a basic understanding of what are the sources which we have when we talk about the Indo-Greek history. So first we have the classical literary text, and these classical literary text talks about 6 names of Indo-Greek rulers or Bactrian rulers, whatever you want to call them. These are Diodotus, Euthydemus, Demetrios, Eucratides, Menander, and Apollodotus. So these are the 6 names that we find in classical Western account. In the Indian sources, we have only 2 names. The first is the famous Indo-Greek king Menander or Milind. So Milind, there's this famous Buddhist text called Milind Panna. So the meaning of this work would be the questions of Milind. So Milind Panna describes the conversation between Menander or Milind and a Buddhist monk named Nagasen. So this is one Indo-Greek that is mentioned in our sources. The second Indo-Greek ruler whose name we know from Indian sources is an Indo-Greek named Antiochus. Now, this Entyalkidas, we know him from an inscription that is found in Madhya Pradesh, Besnagar, or close to Vidisha, which is close to Sanchi. So here, the inscription is by his ambassador Heliodorus. So the inscription is called Heliodorus inscription. Now, this ambassador of Entyalkidas, he traveled to the court of Kashiputra Bhagbhadra, and he describes this. Heliodorus describes himself as a Bhagavat. So these are the two Indo-Greek rulers that are mentioned in Indian sources. But apart from these two literary sources, we have coins of Indo-Greeks, and most of what we know about Indo-Greeks comes from these coins, because as we have seen, the classical sources mentions only 6 names, and the Indo-Greek, the Sanskrit sources mentions 2 names. Whereas when you look at the Indo-Greek coins, we find that there are more than 40 names that appears in these coins. So the kind of knowledge which we have from these coins are the major source for us when we talk about the Indo-Greek history. So when we look at the Indo-Greek history, most of our knowledge is from these coins. And another interesting aspect of these Indo-Greek coins is that they are bilingual coins. Bilingual meaning we find that in these Indo-Greek coins we have the Greek name and also the name in Brahmi or sometimes in Kharoshthi. Now, this feature of the Indo-Greek coins are quite, special, because in other parts of Hellenic world, whether we look at Egypt, we find that there was no, bilingual inscriptions, bilingual coins. We have bilingual inscriptions or even trilingual inscription. The famous Rosetta Stone inscription is a trilingual inscription. So there were bilingual or trilingual inscription, but the coins, bilingual coins are only found in the Indo-Greek case. So this is, I think, an important aspect of Indo-Greek history that we should keep in mind. Now, now let's have a basic overview of Indo-Greek history. So what happens, the starting of Indo-Greek history happens with the invasion of Alexander. So Alexander invades around 327 BC, and after his death, what we see is that by the time of 312 BC, his general Seleucus Nicator, he has acquired control of the eastern parts of Alexander's empire. And what we see is that now Seleucus Nicator has control over mainly the Indian position and also the Asian, most of the Asia which was part of Alexander's empire is now under the control of Seleucus's empire. Now, we all know, the famous interaction between Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya. So I think I would like to, just make 2 points about Seleucus Nicator and whole episode between Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya. Now, about this whole episode, we know this only from the Western sources. Indian sources do not mention the name Seleucus Nicator. So this, I think, we should keep in mind. The second is the war between Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya. So in the reference that comes from classical Western sources, there is no direct reference that there was a war between Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya. Then the third point, which I think is important, is the point about marriage. So you would find that there are some TV serials or even in some books, there is this assumption that is made that Chandragupta Maurya married the daughter of Seleucus Nicator. But when you look at the classical sources does not explicitly say that Seleucus Nicator married his daughter to Chandragupta Maurya. Instead, what we find is that there are mainly there are two sources that talk about some type of a alliance. Now here, what is important is that these sources are Appian and Strabo. Now Appian uses the word kaidos, and this would imply that an actual marriage took place. Now this actual marriage or connection by marriage, so this word kaidos means an actual marriage or connection by marriage. But we are not sure, which marriage Appian is talking about. And there is no direct reference that that Seleucus Nicator married his daughter to Chandragupta Maurya. The second source that talks about some type of an alliance is Strabo. And Strabo uses the word epigamia. Now this term epigamia means right of intermarriage between states. Now some scholars have argued that this was basically an agreement between Chandragupta Maurya and Seleucus Nicator to allow the intermarriage between Indians and the Greeks. So this is, the broad point about the relation between Seleucus Nicator and Chandragupta Maurya. What we can clearly, get from this whole point which I have talked about is that we are not entirely sure whether there was a marriage that took place, or if suppose there was a marriage, whether this marriage involved the marriage of Seleucus Nicator's daughter and Chandragupta Maurya. So we are not entirely sure. So I think it is important for us to keep that in mind. Now coming to the Indo-Greek or Bactrian Greek history, the history of these people start with Bactria. So the region of Bactria is the region which is north of Hindu Kush and south of Amudarya or Oxus. So Oxus is the name that comes in classical sources. So Oxus or Amudarya river. So south of Amudarya river and north of Hindu Kush mountain. So this was the region of Bactria. Now what we find is that this region of Bactria was part of Seleucus Nicator's empire or Seleucid empire, and there were quite a few of Greeks that were living in the Bactrian region. Now here you would find that there are two views why there is this large number of large Greek population residing in Bactria. So first historian is Tarn. So Tarn has this view that these Greek population was mainly the large number of Greek population in Bactria was the result of Seleucid encouragement. So these early Seleucid rulers, what they did was they brought quite a few Greeks from the mainland, and they settled these Greeks in the Bactrian region. Whereas when you read Narain's work, Narain has this argument that these Greek settlements, the large number of Greeks that we find in Bactria, was not the result of the encouragement by early Seleucid emperors. Instead, these Greeks were not really Greeks from the mainland. Instead, what we find is that the large number of Greeks that are present in Bactria, they were the product of intermarriage between the early Greeks and the local Iranian population. So their descendants were the Greeks. So although they had intermixed, but they had preserved their Greek culture. So this is what Narain argues. So the basic history of the Indo-Greeks or Bactrian Greeks starts with the revolt of the Bactrian Greeks. So what happens is that, the Bactrian Greeks revolt and they form a separate kingdom. So they, broke away. So these Bactrian Greeks broke away from the Seleucid Empire. Now this, when this event happened is a matter of debate. I am of the opinion that the Bactrian kingdom emerged as an independent kingdom by the time of 208-206 BC. So, but when you read the works of Narain, you will find that he has a different chronology. But I think this is the broad overview, that it was at the end of 3rd century AD, 3rd century BC, that the Indo-Greeks, the Bactrian kingdom emerged as a independent kingdom. For historians, you would to understand how difficult it is for historians to reconstruct the Indo-Greek history. So this is the date, the date 208 or 206 BC is the date when the Bactrian Greeks had gained their independence, or they had become independent. From this period and up to 10 AD. So 10 AD would be the last reign of the last Indo-Greek ruler. So his name was Strato II. So this period of 216 years, what historians have to do now is that they have to analyze these Indo-Greek coins, and they have to fix the chronology of when different Indo-Greeks rulers ruled and who succeeded whom. So, you can understand how difficult the job of historians is in this reconstruction, because we have only the coins that are available. So, this is the problem when historians basically face when they try to they try to understand the Indo-Greek chronology. Now, one evidence which could help in this analysis is the appearance of monograms. What we find is that in the Indo-Greek coins, there are monograms that are there in those coins, and the number of these monograms is a matter of debate. So these monograms are calculated by some scholars. So some scholars argue that there are in total some 100 monograms, but some scholars have went as far as 450 monograms. So what we find is that in some cases these monograms are based on Kharoshti, but in majority of the cases, it is the Greek letters that are used in these monograms. Now, what these monogram represents is a matter of debate. Whether they represent a mint or whether they represent a city is not. We are not sure. So this aspect of the Indo-Greek coins is an important point, because most of our interpretation is from these coins, and the fact that we know very little about these coins accentuates the problem in the reconstruction of Indo-Greek history. Now, one important aspect of Indo-Greek history that has gained a considerable amount of attention by historians is the invasion of the Indo-Greek, and when these Bactrian Greeks invaded India. And particularly we are talking about the invasion of Patliputra. So Yuga Puran talks about the invasion of Patliputra. And who was the Greek ruler who led this expedition is a matter of debate. Now, when you read Tarn's work, Tarn has this argument that it was Demetrius first who reached as far as Patliputra. So in his argument, Tarn believes that Demetrius has two generals whose name was Menander and Apollodotus. So these two were Demetrius's generals, and Demetrius was the first Bactrian Greek ruler who crossed the Hindu Kush and invaded into India. So after conquering Taxila, what Demetrius does is that he goes up to Patliputra and besieges the city of Patliputra. But this was not a permanent occupation, as we can clearly tell from the Yuga Puran. So after some time, there was this infighting between the Indo-Greeks. That is what Yuga Puran tells us. And after some time, these Indo-Greeks returned to the Yamuna region. Now, so this whole event happened around 150 BC, and that is what Tarn believes. And according to Tarn, Demetrius was the first who established a Greek settlement in Taxila. So this is what, the whole argument of Tarn. Now, I personally do not, do not agree with Tarn's analysis. Narain, I think, is the view of Narain is more plausible in my view. So Narain argues that Demetrius did not reach as far as Patliputra. His conquest was mainly in the Kabul and Indus region. So he did cross the Hindu Kush mountain, but he was not able to extend his rule into the Punjab, leave alone the Gangetic plains. And this period of Indo-Greeks, so this period of Demetrius is the 150 BC. So he agrees with the date, but he did not agree with Tarn's belief that Demetrius crossed the Hindu Kush mountain and besieged the city of Patliputra. Another point which Tarn has this in order to support his argument. Tarn points out that in the Hathi Gumpha inscription of Kharvel, we have the name Dimitar. So this Dimitar, according to Tarn, was Demetrius, and it clearly shows that there was this invasion of the Indo-Greeks, and this invasion went as far as Patliputra. Now, Narain argues that, first of all, Narain has, and I think he is correct, that whether the term Dimitar actually is written in the Hathi Gumpha inscription is a matter of debate, because the word Dimitar is not clear. We can only make out the alphabet Ma. Instead, and all the other characters are not clearly visible. So the fact that historians, particularly I think KP Jaiswal, has this whole view that Hathi Gumpha inscription talks about the Yavana Raja Dimitar. So this Yavana Raja Dimitar, which Jaiswal reads this whole inscription, Narain believes that this is this is a guess by Jaiswal and other scholars, and we cannot clearly say what is written in the Hathi Gumpha, in this part of the Hathi Gumpha inscription. And so this is what Narain believes. Now, in Narayan's view, so who was the person, who was the Indo-Greek ruler who led the expedition to Patliputra? So Narayan believes that there was an Greek invasion, and this invasion went as far as Patliputra. But Narayan argues that it was Menander who led this expedition, and this expedition reached as far as Patliputra. But this was, as we all know, this was not a long occupation. It was just an expedition. And we can say this because, so Narayan has this argument, which I think is a fair argument. So Narayan argues that when you look at Menander's coins, most of these coins are in west of Ravi. But there are some coins that are found in the region of Saharanpur, Sonipat. So basically the region which is which is west of Yamuna. So parts of UP that are west of Yamuna is, we can find Menander coins in these regions. So I think that most likely Menander's territory extended up to the Yamuna river in the Gangetic plains. So this was the extent of Menander's conquest. Now, there are, some interesting theory. There is this scholar called George Woodcock. So George Woodcock, in his book on the Indo-Greeks, writes that, because of this expedition of Menander in Patliputra, Menander developed this interest in Buddhism. And if this invasion of Patliputra had not happened, Menander would not have become a Buddhist. So this is an interesting way to look at the view of how, Menander, when did Menander become a Buddhist? Now, there is, little disagreement between scholars that Menander was a Buddhist. And there is no, debate about this. But when Menander became a Buddhist is a matter of debate, and I think we don't have enough evidence to find out. Particularly now, presently, we don't have enough evidence to say when Menander became Buddhist. We can only speculate. So I think I will not go into this whole topic, but what happens after Menander is important, because what we can say is that it was during the reign of Menander that the Greek ruled reached its peak. So after Menander, it appears that there was this great infighting within the Indo-Greeks, and there were different houses that ruled over different parts of Menander's kingdom. And Narain argues that when this infighting was going on, the Indo-Greek kingdom was attacked by 3 different powers at the same time. So from the region of Hunza, so basically the Gilgit-Baltistan region, it was the Shakas who invaded. And from the region of Bactria, so during this period, so particularly we are talking about the start of 1st century AD. So what happens is that during this, now this is not an actual history, because this is just an interpretation by Narain, because most of the evidence is not sufficient for us to say for certain how the end of Indo-Greeks happened. But Narain has this view that the Indo-Greeks were attacked by 3 different powers at the same time. So from the Hunza region came the Shakas. From the east, particularly the region of Sakastan or the Iranian Baluchistan region. So from here came the Indo-Parthians, or Pahlav as they are called in Indian sources. And from the Bactrian region, the Kushanas attacked. Now, Bactria up to this point was already in the control of the Yuchis. Yuchis were basically the Kushanas. So they were the ancestors of the Kushanas. So because of these 3 simultaneous attacks, the Indo-Greek power collapsed. So this is the broad overview of Indo-Greek history. Now, I have not discussed the whole chronology of the Indo-Greeks, because I think there is no point discussing this chronology, because we don't have enough evidence. We rely mainly on Indo-Greek coins, and I think these coins does not necessarily provide us a credible chronology. Now, coming to the question of how the interaction between the Indians and the Indo-Greeks. So there are different theories, but I am of the view, so George Woodcock in his book writes that what must have happened in the Indo-Greek rule is that the Greeks of this region lived in their own cities and in the military settlements, whereas the Indians lived in their own cities or in their own settlements. And Indians preserved their own caste or jati formation, and the Greek rulers did not try to interfere with the Indians. So basically, George Woodcock has this whole notion of how the British treated the Indian population. Similarly, that's how the Indo-Greeks treated the Indian population. So this is the a basic similarity between George Woodcock's understanding, and he has this belief that the indigenization or Indianization of the Indo-Greeks happened, but it was never complete, because we find that these Indo-Greeks had preserved their theater, gymnasium. So these were always there, and there were also the Indo-Greek, the Greek gods that were always depicted in the coins. So Indianization was there, but Indianization was never complete. Now, I personally believe that although there could be some elements of this theory that could be true, but there is no way for us to, prove for sure whether the Greeks lived in their own settlements and there was no intermingling that was going on. So we have no evidence to prove or reject this theory. Now, what happens is that after the decline of the Indo-Greeks, we see that, with the decline of the Indo-Greek power, it is not that, the Indo-Greek culture also declines. Because we have reference from a merchant who came to India around 44 AD. So his name was Apollonius. So he traveled to India and he visited Takshashila. So in his travels, he writes that when he crossed Hindu Kush, he did not have any problem during interactions because most of the population could understand Greek. And when he visited the ruler of Takshila, so he found that the ruler of Taxila was also well versed in the Greek classics and he conversed with him in Greek. Now, most scholars believe that this ruler of Taxila was not an Indo-Greek ruler. He was most likely a Indo-Parthian ruler, and some scholars believe that he was the famous Indo-Parthian ruler Gondophares. Now, whether it was Gondophares or some other Indo-Parthian ruler, but what is certain is that the Greek culture in India survived well after the destruction of the Indo-Greek power. So I think in this way we can say that the Greek culture in India survived more than the Indo-Greek rule or the Greek rule, because one interesting example of how long this the Greek language survived is the inscription of Kanishk. So Kanishk has this the famous inscription of Kanishk is the Rabatak inscription, and in the Rabatak inscription Kanishk writes that he has replaced the Greek language with the Aryan language, which was Bactrian. Although he uses the Greek script, but now the language is no longer Greek, it is Bactrian. So you can understand how long this Greek culture lasted in India. So I think this is the broad overview of Indo-Greek history and what are the main problems which historians face when they write about Indo-Greek history. So I think one thing which you can get from this whole talk is that most of our conclusions of Indo-Greek history is not very credible. These topics are still continuously evolving, and with new evidence we might know more about the Indo-Greeks, or it could also be the case that what we knew about Indo-Greek history turns out to be wrong. So I think we should keep in mind that the Indo-Greek history, what we read, is not absolute. It could change in future.